In the 21st century, those who change the world are those who change the culture. They get people in sync, lead tribes, create movements, and generate an energy field where ordinary people achieve extraordinary results.
Most of what you think isn't a reflection of what's actually happened. And in fact, most people don't understand that they aren't really the thinker. Like, they're the person observing the thinker. There's just always this tape of color commentary playing in your head. And it's not you in that moment generating the thinking. And if you don't believe this, like when you get up tomorrow morning, notice, do you wake up and then say, I shall commence thinking now? Or just notice when you wake up if you're already being thought. And what happens is the ego part of us, our low self-love, certainty over accuracy. So if somebody walks by me and doesn't say hello, I have zero certainty of what that was about. Zero. All I know for sure is they walked by me and potentially didn't say hello. I might have missed it. So I don't have any certainty about this, but the ego loves certainty. So the ego will very quickly go, oh, I know what this is about. Ever since she got that promotion, she thinks she's better than the rest of us, and she's acting rude.
I'm Aga Bajer, and this is the Culture Lab podcast, where you will find ideas and inspiration on how to harness the power of team and organizational culture. I talk to leadership thinkers, culture experts, entrepreneurs, and all sorts of movers and shakers, and together we explore the fascinating topic of culture, leadership, and personal growth. If you like what you hear, subscribe to the podcast on iTunes. Or better yet, write a review on iTunes and share the podcast with your followers and friends on social media. For more, check out our archive at www.agabajer.com/podcast. Hello, and welcome to episode 51. So, I've been working on my new book, and recently I did a lot of thinking about the echo chambers we all end up living in. Basically, we surround ourselves with people like us in real life, and we get our news from social media feeds, and those feeds get filled up with people like us as well. And everywhere we look, there are people who share our views. And as a result, each of us has our own filter bubble created by invisible algorithms that not only drive our internet experience, but our real life experience as well. And practically speaking, what it does is it limits what we see and how we understand the world. And that's why I feel it's so important to bring diverse voices to this show. And I'm guessing if you are a regular listener, you probably freak out thinking about the filter bubble as well. And you want to listen to people who have a unique and different perspective on culture. And that's why I'm really delighted to have Cy Wakeman on the show today. Cy is New York Times bestselling author, and she brings a fresh and thought-provoking perspective to the topic of leadership. And one of the main reasons that I love her work is because she has a knack for seeing reality in a slightly different way than most of us do. So in this interview, we talk about what can happen when you ditch drama, take accountability, and stop blaming culture for why you can't. I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. Cy, welcome to Culture Lab. I'm so excited to have you as a guest on the show.
Thank you. I'm excited as well.
Wonderful. The first question that I want to ask you is the question I ask all of our guests. And the reason is that Culture Lab is the podcast about culture. And so I'm always curious about the early cultural influences that shaped people. So what made Cy Cy?
Interesting question. I love that you start with that. I was raised in the United States in the Midwest in a town of about 800 people. And so my first experience with culture was pretty homogeneous in my surroundings. I think the biggest difference in culture were the Norwegian Lutherans and the German Catholics. I think, there were just subtle shades of nuance there. So I, from the beginning, was kind of a seeker. I remember in my early years, in the summer, I just loved learning and would go to Bible school at about 8 different denominations of churches, sometimes riding my bike like 10 miles. It just fascinated me to be involved in um, learning about difference and learning about others. And my lifeline, I think, was a gentleman by the name of Al Bell, and he made his living traveling with his wife to other countries. And he would come to these small Midwestern towns and do presentations and show films of his trip to Nepal. And he'd bring like little souvenirs that you could go up on stage and look at. And I remember the Al Bell days being something I looked forward to the entire school year, and in fact was a little in love with Al Bell. Had a little crush on him as a little girl, and I didn't realize until your question how that probably influenced me, at least from country cultures, which is a small slice of what we bring to the workplace. But I then was a foreign exchange student. I chose to leave my high school in the Midwest and travel to Germany. I attended gymnasium and had just an incredible experience living with a woman who was the mayor and was in politics in Germany. And so with her, I got to travel to Moscow. We got to go inside the Kremlin back in the day when the Soviet Union was still the Soviet Union. And that really has set my life. I travel extensively. I love um, opening my mind. But I think probably the biggest influence, not to take too much time on this question, was when I did get to my first history class in Germany. I remember thinking, this teacher just doesn't know what she's talking about, because up until then, in my egocentric view of the world, I really thought that history was like truth, like what you learned and what you took the test on were facts. And I remember this big evolution for me where I realized that history is the story that the people who are in power tell, or the people that kind of won. The people that are marginalized don't really get their history told. And it really put me on a whole nother path early in life as a seeker of focusing more on what I don't know, because that's where the excitement came for me, rather than just living in what I know. And that was really shaping for me, is to just try and be a seeker, be curious a bit longer in life. And I'm grateful for that.
That's wonderful. And, there are so many parallels that I could draw with my life, interestingly, because I also grew up in a very homogeneous society. It was behind the Iron Curtain in Poland in the 70s and in the 80s. Religion wasn't really official back then, but
Yeah.
still 98.8 or whatever of the population were Catholic. So I didn't get that exposure to other cultures and other religions either. And I was always so fascinated by others living abroad and wanted to explore as well. So I can completely identify with how you felt as a little girl. And it's also such an interesting experience with your trip to Germany, and then realizing what history looks like in another country. And it's so true, isn't it? Because then you just ask yourself, what are the stories that other nations are telling themselves, and how does that shape how those countries and how people within those cultures operate?
It's such a big question. I love that connection between the two of us. In fact, when I was in the at that time DDR, East Germany, and we traveled there to visit family, and I remember being very righteous as an American 17-year-old, and I'm like, well, you guys, your media is pure propaganda, and the teenagers there challenged me and they said, yes, there is state-sponsored media. And they said the difference is that we know it's state-sponsored media. And in your country, you're never too sure the source of the information. And so it's much more difficult to discern. And I just am so grateful for people willing to interact with me and have these big dialogues and challenge my thinking, because we study accountability and we know how people develop accountability is that there's dialogue that really challenges them in their thinking, and they're also challenged at work. But, as we get into this conversation on culture, one of the things I think people are fearful of is having this very vulnerable dialogue where all of your blind spots just come streaming out in the form of opinion. And, without that robust dialogue and the courage to be vulnerable and really speak with one another, we think we have a joint culture, but we really walk around with our own culture and judge others based on it.
So one more parallel that I can see between our lives and how we grew up is that when you are a young girl, I've learned through the research that I've done in preparation for this interview, you were a big fan of the Sufi poet Rumi, right?
I totally was. Which was another odd influence, because in a small town in the Midwest, I found a book of Rumi poetry in a closet of a house that we'd moved into. And, the odds of finding something like that is just, that's low. But I fell in love with his poetry, just became obsessed with it, actually.
And it's incredible because I also loved reading Rumi, and I thought that I was literally the only person in the world who was reading Rumi back then. I never met anyone back then who would know of him. So it's so nice to hear that you probably around the same time on the other side of the world fell in love with him and his work. And I know that one of your favorite quotes comes from his poem called A Great Wagon. And it says, out beyond ideas of wrongdoing and right doing, there is a field. I'll meet you there. So let me ask you, Cy, why is this poem so important for you? And how does it inform the work that you do today?
That verse has been meaningful to me for many reasons throughout my life. When I first discovered it, my parents were going through some very tough times. There was a lot of arguing in my home and a lot of judgment. And I remember just thinking suffering is completely optional. Like, this is all people just believing their own story and keeping track of right doing and wrong doing. And for me, it was so appealing that if we just moved beyond judgment, beyond that part of us that, sees the lack in somebody, if we just moved beyond there's this spectacular place we could be, this field. And so that was the beginning of it. And as I went on in my life and became a therapist and a researcher and then a leader, I just started to imagine a workplace that's what I call beyond no ego, beyond ego, that if we can move beyond our biases, our judgment, believing our own thinking without question, beyond our stories, beyond where we're trying to get people to do what we feel comfortable with them doing rather than accepting them as they are, accepting reality as it is. Out beyond that is this ideal workplace that we can have innovation and collaboration and all the things that we crave, something that's easy to engage to. And so that's been my life's work, is helping people understand that when they move out of that primitive part of their brain and their intelligence and use self-reflection and can work to evolve themselves, that work becomes a very different place to be. And sometimes my changing can change everything without changing anything. So at times, I don't even need the culture to change. I can change my view of the culture and find that it was never that bad all along. So, yeah. So that's what it means to me, is this ultimate empowerment that if you want this beautiful culture to work in, it may have a lot more to do with your story and your thinking than it does your reality. Because our suffering comes from our story, not our reality. And a lot of people attribute their suffering to culture. They're like, oh, the culture in this workplace is causing my suffering. But what we know from therapy and from Rumi and from many great teachers is that your circumstances aren't the source of your suffering. They're your happiness isn't correlated to your circumstances. It's correlated to the amount of accountability you take for your circumstances. And the best way I explain this is when I teach once in a while, I'll put a piece of paper on the lens of the projector and a little tiny shredded little piece of paper. And as I start teaching, I'll look at the screen and my slides, and I'll stop the class. I'll ask a student, I'll go, can you figure out what's going on there? There's something on my slides. And they walk up to the screen first, always, to check the screen, to like wipe it off the screen. And it takes them a long time to then look back at the lens of the projector and see that that piece of paper is on the projector lens. And then as we debrief that, people start to realize that when I'm struggling, I tend to immediately go to my reality, what's being projected, and try and fix that, rather than starting with the projector, which is me and my view of that reality, and really working through self-reflection to move myself from low self and ego to high self. Because so many times the simple act of self-reflection fixes everything without changing anything. And so a lot of work is being done on external culture rather than internal evolution. And I think one of the best ways to fashion an amazing culture is to ensure that the people we gather together are involved in their own evolution. Because culture is very different when you gather people together, and it could be in a parking lot, but gathering people together, not perfect people, not enlightened people, but people responsible and involved in their own evolution. What I've noticed is that our natural state as human beings, once the drama's gone, and I research drama, is all the things we desire, like collaboration and accountability and engagement and all those things that we want in the culture, we already have once the drama's gone. And the way I describe this to people is when Michelangelo carved the beautiful statue of David, he was asked afterwards, looking at this masterpiece, he supposedly was asked, was it hard? And he said, no, it wasn't hard at all. I just removed from the marble anything that wasn't David. And I think so many of us, as we do our culture work, we try and create and add into and design an environment. We try and carve out David. And my approach to culture work is we remove anything that isn't conducive to the culture that we desire. We take anything out of the marble that isn't David. And what we take away is the drama. And once the drama's gone, we reveal that people's natural state, when they're in higher levels of consciousness, is connection. And so when we go back to the Rumi quote, it's like when we're beyond that low self behavior we can all be involved in, that which we desire we already have. So there's a lot less culture work to be done when you're doing personal evolution work.
This is a really important point. I think you're so right that the majority of approaches to cultivating culture focus on building the environment. I think that is clearly very important, but I'm totally with you that it's equally and perhaps even more important for each individual who's wishing to see a shift in their culture is to start with themselves and to be able to drop the ego and approach the world without that lens or without that page on the lens and start seeing things clearly would make incredible difference, I'm sure.
I love your point on highlighting that the organization has some responsibility for the environment, and we as individuals have a lot of responsibility for what we bring into the environment.
Yes, absolutely. I want to pick up on something that you've mentioned, which is that you are a drama researcher. So let's decode this a little bit for our listeners. How do you define drama?
So we define drama in two ways. Scientifically, it's unproductive thought processes. So not understanding how your mind works and using and getting played by your own ego. And so it's mental processes that aren't healthy or productive. And it's also disruptive behavior, which is most of the time our reaction to those processes. So when I work with people, I work a lot to teach them first how their mind works so they quit getting played by their ego, and then how the world works, because part of their experience that's so dissatisfying is they get into this argument with reality where their argument with reality is the argument they'll lose, but only like 100% of the time. But the way people understand it best is we call it emotional waste. It's waste in the workplace. It's things that take away from what we want to create in results or the environment that we want to create in culture. So anything that takes away from culture or results is waste. And to us, we're most interested in drama, which is emotional waste, which then the solution is, if you want to get rid of waste in the workplace, you use good processes. And if you want to get rid of emotional waste, you use good mental processes. And so one of the contributions I try and make for companies that are working through to enhance culture is a big part of culture is helping people use better mental processes so that they're not played by their ego. And a leader's role is to help facilitate those mental processes to, get rid of emotional waste. And it really makes a difference. Yeah.
Mm. And so let's talk a little bit about this emotional waste. I love the term, by the way, emotional waste, to make it real for our listeners. So what would this look like in a workplace? Could you give us a few examples of how drama plays out in the workplace from your experience?
Sure. So what we've been able to do is quantify the amount of time most people spend in drama. These are good, hard workers. And it's 2.5 hours a day. It's 816 hours a year, where it's waste. And it's not only waste in productivity, but it's time people spend feeling bad. It's like, so the sources of drama are ego behaviors. Even if you don't do it outwardly and verbally, it's venting, judging, scorekeeping, tattling, judging. And it's stepping down. Lack of accountability is a key source of drama, where instead of looking at what's my part in this mess, we look at how the world's done us wrong. It's resisting change. A lot of people are not adept at moving quickly into what's next. They don't keep themselves in a state of readiness. And so they get into drama when things do change, and their response lags or drags in response to that. A key source of drama is when people forget that buy-in is a verb. It's something we have to bring to the employment situation, our own willingness. And many times a key source of drama is engagement and the efforts we make in engagement, because at times we over-index towards culture and engagement. And without accountability, without that personal evolution, we find that engagement without accountability creates entitlement and dependency, and people being really disgruntled a lot. So we have been able to really see these behaviors and see how some of our efforts to improve culture are actually instead fueling drama.
I'm really curious now because I've recently discovered studies around our levels of energy at work. And it seems that an average Brit, it was the study was done in Great Britain, spends 2.5 hours in low energy states. And I'm wondering if there is any overlap, between those 2.5 hours spent in drama and 2.5 hours of being in low energy states. Because actually some other studies say that stuff like sleep and nutrition and stress and so on and so forth, they can only generate up to 30% of the energy that we experience every day. And the rest of the energy is emotional energy. So it makes complete sense to me that if people spend 2.5 hours per day in drama, they will feel completely drained. at work?
Oh my gosh. I think you just gave birth to my new, some new research. I hadn't heard this. This is phenomenal. I'd love for you to connect me into some of those sources because
Yeah.
what I often tell people is when they're experiencing burnout, they're like, well, I just need a break. I need a vacation. I need sleep. And I'm like, you know what? When your soul's tired, sleep won't help. Like,
Yeah.
it only goes so far. And a lot of times to protect ourselves, we unplug from work to try and conserve our energy and wholeheartedness. And as Brene Brown talks about vulnerability and actually leaning in, not with effort, but with heart, open mind, open heart, connects us back into the energy source of our work. And what people find is reality is never as harsh as their story would make it out to be.
Yes.
But an easy example of this is I worked with just a fantastic group of nurses in intensive care. And after they'd had my training, they learned to really edit their stories, question their thinking, not get played by their ego. And I went to see them and I said, how are you guys doing today? And they said, oh my gosh, it's crazy today. Cy, it's absolutely crazy. It's nuts. And I said, well, I'm looking at the census and it is, I can validate it's busy. Is it busy or crazy? And they're like, Cy, you don't understand. It's nuts. It's crazy. It's insane. They were using all these adjectives. And I said, reflect for just a minute. See if you can loosen the ego's grip on your world through self-reflection. What do you know for sure? And they go, well, Cy, we know what you would say. We only know for sure that we're busy. And I said, so if that's the reality, we're busy, where did the crazy come from? And this one woman in bliss said, oh my gosh, I added that. And I'm like, yeah, you added that. Was it helpful? And she's like, no, it's completely unhelpful. It's like when I'm busy and I add that I'm crazy, now I'm working hard, but working hard with a grudge. And so what people don't realize is that we have challenges at work that grow and stretch us and invite us to really learn new things. But when we add the story onto it is where our energy declines, where we disengage, where we struggle.
Yeah, absolutely. And the funny thing is, when I was reading your book of reality-based leadership, I was thinking, well, I'm not really a person who creates a lot of drama in my life. So I wonder if I'm going to learn something useful here. And then I got to the chapter on stories we tell ourselves. And I realized that actually I generate a lot of low-grade drama. So, it's not the kind of drama that will give me heart attack or cause major waves for my team or my clients. But I think it is chipping away at my ability to be at my best. So what is it about the stories that we tell ourselves that gives them so much power over how we show up and what's possible for us?
Well, the one thing that is within our control that gives our stories power is the moment we choose to believe them without question. So a lot of people are like, Cy, what's your best advice? I'm like, stop believing everything I think. And so what people don't realize is how this works and how they get played by their egos. So most of what you think isn't a reflection of what's actually happened. And in fact, most people don't understand that they aren't really the thinker. Like they're the person observing the thinker. There's just always this tape of color commentary playing in your head. And it's not you in that moment generating the thinking. And if you don't believe this, like when you get up tomorrow morning, notice, do you wake up and then say, I shall commence thinking now? Or just notice when you wake up if you're already being thought. And what happens is the ego part of us, our low self-love, certainty over accuracy. So if somebody walks by me and doesn't say hello, I have zero certainty of what that was about. Zero. All I know for sure is they walked by me and potentially didn't say hello. I might have missed it. So I don't have any certainty about this, but the ego loves certainty. So the ego will very quickly go, oh, I know what this is about. Ever since she got that promotion, she thinks she's better than the rest of us, and she's acting rude. And so the ego quickly takes ambiguity and turns it into certainty, even if there's no chance at accuracy, right? So it's like she's rude. And then what happens is I see her as rude. I treat her rudely. She responds rudely. And then I go, see, I'm right about stuff I make up. And we start to believe everything we think. Where imagine the power if she walked by and I could just borrow something from my Zen Buddhist friends. I would go, oh my gosh, walk by noted, potential no hello, no attachment. I don't want to suffer. I will conserve my energy and go on and add value. Like, what a difference. Same experience, two ways to move through that joy or misery, your choice, but people miss out on the your choice part. And even better than that is if I want to contribute to culture, I have so much power to give that person benefit of the doubt. They walk by me and don't say hello, and I'm like, oh my gosh, instead of seeing insults where there isn't any, I'm going to assume positive intent. She was probably deep in prayer and meditation for peace in the world and didn't see me. And now I can treat her well. She treats me well. And I've been able to co-create something. If I have to make something up, let's co-create something in favor of culture. And that's where people miss out on their superpower when it comes to their impact in their own culture at work, is this power of co-creation, this power of giving positive intent, of not at least giving negative intent, and not getting played by their ego. And so it's quit believing everything you think. Be careful what you think you know for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And in your book, you share this wonderful exercise that I'm definitely going to adopt in my life and in my work, which is editing your story. Yeah. And I think it would be very useful for our listeners as well. Could you just walk us really quickly through how to do it and what's the value of doing it?
Sure. Whenever you're feeling stress, it's an alarm clock going off that you're probably believing something untrue. Our reality is just pretty neutral. Einstein said the world's benevolent at worst, right? And so when you're feeling stress, it's time to check in. And what I encourage people to do is write down very specifically what they're believing in the moment, uncensored. It's only for you, but be frank. They do this crap on purpose and they're trying to set me up and they always and I never, and like write it down. And once you get it written down, it's okay to take a little bit of a break, come back to it and go sentence by sentence with a marker to cross out anything that is judgmental, assignment of motive, any adjective, any assumption, anything you can't possibly know for sure, absolutely, that it's true. And you'll just get down to the facts and then go back and read what's left. And you'll realize that your reaction is probably way out of proportion from the reality that just happened. And a very quick one, I was driving in this morning and this, blankety blank SOB cut me off in traffic, trying to kill me, doesn't, appreciate, and probably because he's a male and he thinks I'm a female, and it was a total act of aggression, and he, doesn't allow for any other room on the road. Like if I wrote all that down and I went back and it's like, he did this on purpose, total act of aggression, all of that would have to come off. And I would end up with something like, on the way to work today, someone moved into my lane, leaving me less distance than I prefer. Mm-hmm. And when you look at the world of suffering, like if I am driving, I have two environments. One where there's an SOB who's trying to kill me, and the other is somebody moved into my lane, providing less space than I prefer. Those are the same commutes. But because of my willingness to question my thinking, very different experiences. And that's the power you can play in your own experience of culture, at work and at home.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I love this exercise because, on so many levels, I think one of the reasons is because I am a writer. And I do my morning pages, which is a technique devised by Julia Cameron, when you sit down and write 3 pages longhand every single morning. And I also do some editing of my own work sometimes, and I know how painful it can be to cross out those things. And I'm wondering, from your experience working with clients, do you find that people experience pain as well when they are editing their stories and taking out all these emotional details? Because I'm assuming that there might be some pain and resistance, because drama sometimes can be addictive. It's a little bit like being on heroin.
Yeah.
We know that it's not good for us, but for some reason, sometimes we enjoy it, don't we?
We do. And it affects the same kind of neural pathways as addictive things. Like drama really gives us some good brain chemicals. So what I see people doing is it's binary. Their ego is in pain because experiencing a death, but their bliss centers are activated where they're suddenly either start laughing or smiling when they realize how they're being played by their ego. Like I had this situation where a woman was really focused on improving her skills in training, and I was glad to work with her. She was just really open and willing. And so I had a client that was also willing to give her some feedback and knew that she was a junior trainer. And I arranged where she would go in and train for free, and the gift would be this feedback. And her name's Lisa. She wanted to do that. So she went in and did her training, and she called me sobbing. And as are you still in the office? I'm like, yes, come in. What happened? And she started to tell me her story. And she's like, they shredded my class and they just ripped it and tore it apart. And they, totally ripped apart my PowerPoint, and they were ungrateful. And one guy who doesn't have any training background was totally arrogantly for like 45 minutes telling me what I could do differently. And so I'm listening because she wasn't in a state to really edit her story, but I'm listening. She knows this work, and I'm listening for the facts as her colleague. And so I only found 3. As I'm listening intently, I found 3 things that really did happen. The rest she added in. And I said, so can I have permission to let you know what I heard that were the facts? And she's like, yes. And she is sobbing. And I said, number 1, you asked for feedback, correct? She said, yes. Number 2, you got feedback. Yes. Number 3, now you cry. And she started laughing like you did. She went from sobbing to laughing.
Yeah.
And it was total relief. Like, how did people respond as they edit? In the beginning, they resist it. But in the end, they can look back, and this huge issue where they thought they'd need to divorce their spouse ends up with them laughing at how gullible they are when their ego plays them. Mm-hmm. And it's this instant joy and relief. And that's how a lot of people respond when they realize that what they're suffering from probably never even happened. Yeah. It's just their story.
I love that. And I can see how that happens, because I did play with this exercise in my mind, not really writing it down, and I had exactly the same reaction. So I just started laughing. So wonderful. And if our listeners would like to see further instructions to this exercise, just get Cy's book, and it's all in there. So I want to circle back a little bit to what you've mentioned before about co-creating culture. I found something in your book that was really revelatory for me. It was a big takeaway for me. And that is something that I think someone had shared with you a while ago. And what they said to you was, whatever you are missing in a situation, it's that you are not giving. So when you feel like everyone is closed-minded, be open-minded. When you believe that people are dishonest, be honest. So basically be the change that you want to see. I think it's very, very relevant to culture as well, because very often people will say, oh, our culture is so competitive and no one collaborates here really, and so on and so forth. And when you ask them, okay, so when was the last time you tried collaborating with someone and being generous and supporting them? They're like, So I just love that. Can you speak to this a little bit more, co-creating culture?
I'm so glad that you brought that up, because so many of us, what I worry about is this work on culture hurts personal accountability, because sometimes culture becomes our reasons and stories and excuses about why we can't, that we all agree upon. Like, I'm like, sometimes culture are just agreed upon reasons, stories, and excuses. I'm like, why can't, what's going on here? Well, I can't do it because no one is collaborative. Our culture is competitive. And so many times when we're seeing something that is easy to judge, it's our turn to call ourselves to greatness and say, if I want more collaboration, I'll start being collaborative. And the ego will be like, well, no, you can't. And, people will not succeed then. But you either need to believe your story or believe or have integrity to your values. If you value collaboration, be collaborative. But a lot of people are like, well, I only want to be collaborative if I know it'll be rewarded. I'm like, well, no, if you believe in collaboration, it's not about motive. It's not about, only doing that which you will gain from. If it's a value, that's just who you are and how you do. And I'm in like 200 cultures a year. And in my work and in my speaking. And what I would tell you is true freedom is being able to live your own values, regardless of what the culture is, because there's a super culture I think we all need to align to, which is what we know works best in business. We all know collaboration works best in business. So instead of saying what my culture is, it's like, what is this super culture I'm going to align to and make it portable and bring wherever I go. And I think too often we cop out in culture's our reason why we can't. And it's like, no, wait, if you know what's good, then bring it. And we also cop out because we think we can't impact culture, but we can always impact our climate and that small area around us. And what I like to do in culture change, instead of trying to change the culture, is I try and impact climates and get people operating healthily and without judgment and at their highest self. And then once you start to create climates, you can knit climates together. And then in kind of a positive type of global warming, so to speak, then the culture changes. But the culture we see is outside of us, and we quickly get into learned helplessness rather than within our own power. An example, I talked to a woman I just recently coached who was from, and I don't remember the country, her origin was from a country, she was female in the Asia Pacific area. And she was senior vice president, and she was not speaking up in meetings and was then afterwards very resentful and having meetings after the meetings, very poor behavior about what she thought of the meeting, but she wasn't stepping into the power she had in the meeting, which was a seat at the table. And I said, the next thing we need to work on is for you to get very direct and for you to speak and form a relationship with your colleagues instead of leaving the meeting and being passive aggressive. And she did not want to look at the fact she's passive aggressive. She wanted to use her culture as an excuse. She said, well, in my culture, we don't speak up around elders and around men, and it's just not our way to be confrontational. And I said, here's what I'd like you to learn. When it benefits everyone in the room and your customers, adhere to your culture of origin. When it doesn't, align with the super culture, which is how to be successful in conscious capitalism, which is I need to forego my culture, which is now my preference, and look at the potential of the situation where I have to step outside of myself and align towards what the situation needs in the moment. And that's really this movement beyond ego again. And so I kind of preach like, I don't know that we as a company need all these individual cultures. I think the science has shared with us what works in collaborative business structure and that there's really the super culture we need to align to. But it takes evolution to leave my personal preference and my culture of origin and align with a super culture. That's an evolution.
Yeah.
And it's like, how do we go from country to, globe to galaxy? It's the same evolution.
Yeah, yeah. Oh my God, there's so much stuff that I would like to unpack there. It's so fantastic. I love, first of all, I love the phrase portable culture and like how you can, and the super culture as well. I sometimes like to say that everyone's responsible for the culture in the radius of 2 meters from where they stand.
I love
So,
that.
right? Because culture is, of course, it's global, but it's also local. And you cannot probably change the culture, but you can definitely change a culture, as Seth Godin said, your little pocket of the world. So that's one thing. And absolutely, I think it all starts with the individual. And I also love what you said about, challenge and question whatever culture is driving your behavior, whether it's your organizational culture or your national culture. And I love this question about, does it benefit my colleagues, my clients? Because if not, then why do this? Why copy behaviors that are not working? So I think this is an important takeaway for everyone. Whatever is happening, if you know that it's not benefiting anyone, you have the power to change it and behave differently. Cy, I want to ask you another question about your view on the times that we live in, because we definitely live in times of exponential change. And, the only certainty that we can have is that there will be more change and with more complexity, and it will be coming at us faster than ever before. So what are the 3 top skills, if you could zoom in on 3 top skills that we all need to be able to respond well to this environment?
I think it's more of a competency than a skill, but we've got to maintain our own readiness. When something changes and you're chronically surprised by it, you're not maintaining readiness. I want to be ready enough that when somebody says, we are now going to use this different software, that I'm like, oh, I saw that coming. A lot of people are migrating to that. That doesn't surprise me. So readiness is one piece. The ability to say yes, as often or more often as we say no, I think is really a skill set, because we're very adept at saying no and honoring our personal preference, but the ability to say yes and then to bring our expertise to like, here's how we can do it, is probably the second one. And then I would say a skill set is the ability to, we don't even use the word change in our company. We use the word next. And so it doesn't bring any baggage with it. It's like, here's what's next. Here's where we're going next. Here's how this is going to work next. So we don't say, here's a big change. And so skill set I want my people to have is the ability to get in the flow, because once you resist change, you're out of the flow. You're out of the natural order of things. You're really, you have jumped out of the raft and you're trying to hold on to like the riverbank. And so I need people, and it's like being on a roller coaster. You have to have a tolerance for that feeling in the pit of your stomach that drops out. Like, I need people to have skill sets around being able to stay in the flow, and not drop out all the time, for safety reasons.
I love that. So one last question. I realized, getting familiar with your work, that it's been inspired by spirituality and improv theater and a lot of other influences. And I have to say that I'm really so impressed how you've been able to integrate that and simplify it and make it accessible to people who don't have that background and don't necessarily are familiar or even identify with these philosophies. So my question, slightly selfish one, because I would love to be able to do that, was, what was your process? How did you arrive at what your work is today? Was it easy for you to do? Is it an innate talent that you have, or did you have to hone this art of making things simple and easy to understand for people and easy to implement also?
And it's a combination of both. I think that one of the gifts I bring to the table is I can see complex situations and counterintuitively kind of see the simplistic, the place where we're missing the point, like the simplistic view of how your story's playing you. I think I'm good at doing that because I really do a lot of personal evolution. I do transcendental meditation twice a day. I read a lot. I don't immerse myself in business books as much as I immerse myself in, the great teachers, whether it's Rumi or Byron Katie or Eckhart Tolle or, um, any of the great philosophers, the great writers. I think that business is the execution, and to be good at execution, we can't study execution. We've got to study all the wisdom that's been given to us over time, so that as executioners, the people doing the executing, we are most evolved coming to the table. And so that being said, we work really hard at boiling things down to the essence, and language is important to us. And when we certify people to train our work, we have trainers all over the world that are certified in our work. When we really pay attention to language, and what I would say is, like the Japanese brush paintings, they'll study something for 2 hours and then with a single brush stroke, deliver the essence of that to the table or to the paper so that you can see that brush stroke is a teacup. It is not the artists who study the art, it's the artists who study the object in order to translate it into the art. And that's where I think we're not doing enough in our work at work. We're focusing much on execution and not a lot. And we focus on development of what it takes to execute, but we aren't focusing on evolution of the people so that they come tapped into higher levels of knowing, higher levels of consciousness, so they can bring flow to the thing. We usually are operating out of our ego, which is the most primitive form of our intelligence, instead of in higher levels of consciousness, which is like all of our intelligence.
I love that. And I think it's a nice segue to one of the questions from our listeners. We have a question from Martin Ulrich.
My question is, a strong culture at its fundamental base must have a common language. When it comes to training at any of the levels of organization, there could exist a language barrier based on terminologies that are unknown to those who did not get trained. How strong of an impact do you think this has on their culture? When new terminologies are introduced, only a few of the people within that organization. I look forward to hearing your answer, and thank you.
Martin, that's a great question. I can tell you're doing a lot of intensive thinking about this. I do believe that common language is important, and we try and develop common language. But just because we both speak English doesn't mean we actually have a common language, because our interpretation is so heavily involved. And so I think that your reality is you're always going to have some language challenges that you can work to mitigate with, finding language and ensuring that people have some common understanding. But your insurance policy is ensuring how people fill in the gaps. And so it's one thing to know what I know, but it's another thing how I fill in the gaps. And if I fill in the gaps with positive intent, it will go far in holding space for us to get more clear on things we don't understand. If I can stay curious just 1 ounce longer rather than react or move boldly in the face of lack of information, it's really important. So if you go back to the old communication studies, only 7% has to do with what you say anyway. 35 or 38% has to do with your tone of voice, and 55% your body language. Well, when you think about an email coming out, I only have 7%, and I'm going to fill in 93% of the context, whether I speak the same language or not. If I can fill in 93% with positive intent, benefit of the doubt, I'm going to do my part in holding space for a good culture in spite of some language barriers. And in that space, then we can work towards gaining clarity and understanding of the language. But most people put the weight on, I'm not clear, I don't understand the language, you must clarify. And I've just abdicated my responsibility or what I could bring to the table in this by saying, until you do the heavy lifting of making me aware of all of the words and the meanings, then I'm not responsible yet. Mm-hmm. And again, I think it's a stall mechanism.
Yeah. So we have, thank you so much. And we have another question from Christine Tomaszewski.
How do you diffuse the drama in a group of people who believe that their religious rights extend into the workplace? In a faith-based health system, how do you define that the greater good is for those we serve for changes that are need to be made without it turning it into a debate?
Well, first of all, I love the question, Christine, because it's a common one. A lot of people put, how do I do this? And then they add this big request without it hurting anybody's feelings, without it turning into a debate, without it creating conflict, without.
Mm-hmm.
And given that condition of the question, I can't really tell you how to control others. Right? You can't really change other people. What I can tell you is that you can do a lot of work in what is good mental processes, things that you're willing to give energy to and things that you're not as a leader. And so I've worked in faith-based health systems, and people get confused with their own personal preferences, and they call it religion and then bring it to impose that on others. And so it's going back to really establishing core beliefs. The patients have a right to self-determination. Our organization values that we value preferential treatment to the poor. And whenever somebody's going overboard to say, well, here's what the patient should choose, I often say, time for self-reflection. Is that our role? What do our values speak towards that? Is it ever appropriate as a health practitioner to move into determination for another? What do our ethics say about that? Self-reflection, people go boldly forward with trying to control the world in ego behavior because they lack self-reflection. You can't control and reflect at the same time. You can't vent and help at the same time. You can't vent and self-reflect. Like, you can't focus on controlling the world when you're involved in self-reflection. So the only way I know how to break the ego's grip on someone, which is what this is the ego's telling them in the name of religion, we must do this, is to move back and to move into self-reflection. Now, there are some people who just are not going to go there. I don't know that I can change them, but a lot of people want to change folks. And I'm like, you can't really, but do look at how you enable folks. So like a lot of times I worked in a Catholic system, and people, even though insurance companies paid for birth control for women and men, and even though someone might not believe that for their own personal life, as they were checking in a patient who came for birth control from our system, they would put their own preferences on there, and they would like try and talk them out of birth control, right? Mm-hmm. So it wasn't that I could change their view of that, but enabling them is for me not to address that and advocate for patient rights. And a lot of times if we go, oh, that's just how she is, and I'm going to maneuver so those patients get to a different provider, and I'm going to just really under the covers try and, that's all enabling. Instead of from a performance management system to say, I need for you to come to me with a plan on how you will serve patients according to their wishes, as long as it's not illegal or unethical, and what's your plan to do that and marry up to this work. And instead, we start to make our own plan and try and bend reality to not ever have to have some of those courageous discussions. So rather than focusing on how to change these folks, I would love this person to reflect on how they enable the behavior of those folks. That's what you can control, is stop the enabling.
I love that. So, Cy, 2 more minutes of your time. We have a section in this interview, in this podcast, which is called Rapid Fire Questions. And I'm going to ask you 5 questions in rapid succession, and we'll aim at answering them in under 2 minutes. Okay? Are you up for it? All right. Yep. So the first one is, how do you define organizational culture?
Unfortunately, it's reasons, stories, and excuses agreed upon by people as why they can't get stuff done. So I would rather people look at climate.
And what are the signs that a culture needs some work, or perhaps even a major overhaul?
Anytime there is drama evident, anytime people are believing that their suffering comes from their circumstances rather than their level of accountability in those circumstances.
Are there any companies that you admire for their culture?
Oh my gosh, there's a lot of them, but I have to break for a minute. I would say my company has an amazing culture where we screw it up every day, and we practice going beyond ego. So reality-based leadership, I would brag about them. Our culture is fantastic.
Okay. And what books on culture or on leadership would you recommend to our listeners? Aside of your books, and of course, we're going to post all the links to your books.
Thank you. I would recommend stop reading books, not stop, but move away from right now reading books on culture or leadership. I think that there's a lot of groupthink going on. My success has been reading philosophers, writers, spiritual teachers of all backgrounds. So I would stop reading culture and leadership books. The majority of books I read are of great thinkers and great spiritual leaders. So I love Byron Katie's Loving What Is. Yeah. It teaches you how to question your own thinking. I would start there.
I love it too. And what is one thing that our listeners can do tomorrow to build their own culture lab and start cultivating a culture and a climate that will help them and their teams to bring their vision to life?
I think question your own thinking. Get very curious about what you've come to believe to be true, and get very curious about others so that you can go beyond your bias and listen to what they're really trying to educate you on.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. One last question that I'm going to have for you is whether you have someone to recommend as a guest on the podcast.
Oh my gosh, there's so many great people. I love Mike Ellis. He's in Australia doing some beautiful culture work. And I think that he could speak more to how to take and really apply some of the things I talk about into the true building of a culture.
Wonderful. Mike Ellis.
Yes.
Could you connect us? Do you know him personally?
I do. I will connect you.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you. So in closing, Cy, what are final thoughts that you'd like to leave our listeners with?
What we have for our culture is we ask people to evolve yourself and remember that love wins. So if you're out to win, I would err on the side of loving people.
I can't think of a better way to end this. Thank you so much. It was such a pleasure.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.
I'm Aga Bajer, the creator and host of the Culture Lab podcast, and this is the Culture Lab team.
Production Manager, Lindsay Nunez.
Art Director, Emily Spencer.
Aaron Scott, Content Editor.
Sound Producer, James Eade, Be Heard.
If you haven't subscribed to the Culture Lab yet, you can do it on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, and many other places where podcasts are available. If you'd like to subscribe to my newsletter, The Culture Lab Insider, go to www.agabajer.com/podcast and scroll down to the very bottom of the page. That's www.agabajer.com/podcast. Also, we would be ever so grateful if you could rate and review our podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to it. Think about it for a moment. We live in an unpredictable world where risks multiply exponentially. And when things go off the rails, it's usually pretty bad. And up until recently, all people talked about in this context was crisis management. But my next guest says that crisis management is an outdated approach and that organizations should learn how to cultivate a crisis-ready culture. A kind of culture that translates into an invincible brand. So have a listen to a short preview of my conversation with Melissa Agnes, the author of Crisis Ready.
The media likes to say that in 2017, I believe, that Uber hit the crisis, that everything, it was one thing after the other with Uber. But the reality was that they had a cultural crisis, and culture is led from the top down and then supported bottom up. And their crisis was their founding CEO. They had that for years. In 2017, it just all of the corrosion just finally erupted.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Cultureland. If you found any moments that were interesting, inspiring, or maybe even game-changing, please share it with someone who'd appreciate it. After all, good ideas are meant to be shared.